Today is Monday, December 7th, 2020. Let's not forget December 7th, 1941. And let's not forget all the people who gave their lives for America. And at the time, we had a segregated armed services. And there was a man named Doris Miller on the USS West Virginia. And when the Japanese attacked, he was a cook, African-American cook. And he got a hold of the machine guns and started shooting down Japanese planes left and right. He later on received the Navy Cross for that. Let's not forget him. Doris Miller, African-American cook, who, living in a segregated society, grew up in Waco, Texas, defended his country.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
That was President Roosevelt addressing Congress the day after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 79 years ago today. Joining us now, presidential biographer Craig Shirley. Among his many historical books is one on the Pearl Harbor attacks entitled December 1941, 31 Days That Changed America and Saved the World. Also with us, historian and Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, John Meacham, who unofficially advises President-elect Joe Biden, and President of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, is back with us as well.
John Meacham unofficially advises Joe Biden. He also wins Pulitzer Prizes.
I just like that.
In his pastime. He's not doing that. So, John Meacham, let's begin with you. We've been looking through the eyes of other presidents, give advice to Joe Biden through their stories, their lives, and what lessons they learned. But let's talk about this event that we remember today. That is, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. What can Joe Biden take away from FDR and this incredibly important chapter in America's history?
Well, I think the first thing is that presidents never quite know what's coming at them. History happens. That's why it's history and not an absolutely predictable series of events. FDR had two of the great crises of American history on his watch. The crisis of capitalism, and then the crisis of fascism abroad and the future of democratic institutions, lowercase d, around the world. The other is Roosevelt had a remarkable capacity to lead what was even then two Americas. There was an isolationist America. Isolationist sentiment was incredibly strong. Today is the day that pushed America. This is a very important point. America did not decide, you know what, we're going to go save the world for liberty. We were attacked on this day by Japan, and then it took us 5 days, as Craig knows well, to declare war on Nazi Germany, which we only did after Hitler declared war on us. And so Arthur Schlesinger used to talk about how isolationism versus interventionism in the late 30s and 40s, as this day was coming, was as divisive as Vietnam. And I would argue perhaps even more so, we're divided in that way. And so you have to find a way to talk to both those constituencies while you try to crystallize and lead.
And Craig Shirley, you wrote the book, obviously, on Pearl Harbor. Tell us what the incoming president can learn from the lessons of those 31 remarkable days.
The presidency is ultimately about big ideas. It's about big initiatives. It's about leadership. And on leadership, you cannot lead a divided country very well. You must have unity. And so when you become president, you have to forget about your base. Yes, you're still an ideological man or a political man or woman in the future sometime. But you also have to speak to and lead all the American people. And FDR knew that innately. And so did Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, had been a Democrat longer when he was elected in 1980, had been a Democrat longer than been a Republican. And so he often made appeals, and that's what produced the Reagan Democrat, because he made cultural appeals to Democrats, ethnic Democrats in the cities. But he knew that a president can't just lead from his base. He has to lead from a sizable majority of the American people. And if you look at the history of the American presidency, most successful presidents led from a majority of the American people, not just from their base.
Yeah, and Richard Haas, what makes today so different is the war that we're facing right now. It is a common enemy. Everybody is challenged by and threatened by the coronavirus, and yet the nation is so divided about it.
Yeah, both Craig and John correctly point out a certain reluctance in American history to go to war. I also think there's two other lessons that Joe Biden ought to take from today. One is the risks of preventive strikes. Japan won the battle that day, but Japan lost the war that day as well. What it did was, rather than sap American morale, it actually brought Americans together, generated an enormous war effort. So it's a real lesson that preventive attacks, it's easier to start wars than it is to finish them. The other is one on us, which is the danger of assumptions and intelligence. And almost like the way Israel got attacked in 1973 by the Arabs, they weren't looking for it. We had dismissed a lot of things there, and it's a real lesson, whether it's pandemics or, in this case, a military attack, to question your own assumptions. Just because you're not looking for something doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Let's talk, John Meacham, about Andrew Jackson briefly. The book for which you won the Pulitzer Prize, you wrote that during the Bush era, and there were certainly some parallels there that you brought out effectively. But what's the big takeaway from Andrew Jackson's 8 years in the White House that Joe Biden can learn from?
I think a relentless focus on what Jackson called the plain working people. It's a slight paraphrase from the bank veto message. But Jackson understood that the country had an innate, and it was pretty innate because we were only a half century old at that point, distrust of elites. The idea that the haves and the have-nots, that drama was an ambient one for Jackson. And he convinced a significant majority of white people in that era that he was their champion, that against the Congress, against the Bank of the United States, against the South Carolina interest that was trying to nullify federal laws, against all of these forces, he was their champion. And I think that repeating that message as long as you possibly can and as frequently as you can is essential. Jackson understood that, in fact, the presidency was the one point in the system where all eyes could turn. And so he understood that. He used it. TR gets the credit for the bully pulpit, but Jackson understood that intuitively.
And Craig, surely, obviously, you're a prolific historian on all things Ronald Reagan. What message does Ronald Reagan teach Joe Biden?
Read your mail. That was the one unspoken piece of history about Ronald Reagan, or underreported piece of history, is that he assiduously read his mail. Not all of it, to be sure, because he got thousands of pieces of mail on a monthly basis, or a daily, weekly basis. But he would get, his secretary would pick out 3 or 4 letters from the hate pile, 3 or 4 letters from the love pile, and 3 or 4 letters from the hurting pile. And he would read all of them. And this was his way of getting past the Washington elites, the way Jackson wanted to get past the elites. and reach the American people and see what was on their minds and what was going on in their lives. And often he wrote letters to them, private letters, personal letters, offering advice, offering solace, giving, whatever he can. Sometimes he sent checks to people who were hurting. One time he sent a check to a woman and she didn't cash it for a month. And finally he called her. He was balancing his checkbook in the White House. And he called her. She was living in Indiana, and he wrote her a check. And he said, "Why didn't you cash my check?" She said, "Well, Mr. President, when I took it to my bank and they said, yes, this is the signature of the President of the United States, I wanted to keep it as a souvenir." And Reagan said, "Well, listen, I'll tell you what. I'm going to send you a second check, but don't cash both of them."
It's funny. And finally, Richard Haas, on this Pearl Harbor Day, we're certainly hearing ominous warnings on many fronts about China's growth, their military expansion. How do we approach China over the next 4 years? How does Joe Biden approach China in a balanced way over the next 4 years?
Joe, it'll be extraordinarily difficult because we're going to have to figure out how we push back against China in a way that hopefully doesn't lead to escalation and in a manner that doesn't preclude cooperation, say on climate change or dealing with North Korea, where it's still in our interest. So it will be a real test of statecraft, of foreign policy to get this balance right. One thing, though, is we shouldn't be doing it alone. We've got all these partners and allies in Asia and in Europe. Let's take advantage of them. Let's approach China collectively rather than making it a bilateral competition. I think we've got a much better chance there. And lastly, there's some things we've got to do for ourselves. We've got to improve American competitiveness. That's about immigration policy. It's about all the things we do to deal with COVID to get our economy going. If we free ourselves up to compete with China, we can do just fine.
All right, John Meacham, Craig Shirley, and Richard Haas, thank you all so much for being with us. And Craig Shirley, if you want to keep your blood pressure down, do not, for God's sake, do not watch Showtime's 4-part documentary on Ronald Reagan, because you will find out that if you support the localized, trying to keep things on the local level as much as possible, that you hate black people, you will find out that if you support small government, you hate poor people. And if you smiled every time Ronald Reagan said whale, then you supported nuclear war.
And that his son is very...
I've never seen anything like... I got to say, even all these years later, it's amazing how much Ronald Reagan still angers people. And really, for me, the highlight of it, when Miko said, "You have got to stop talking at the TV set," was when Reagan made that extraordinary move towards ending the threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union.
Yes.
What did Showtime do? They then decided, instead of talking to Russian experts, instead of talking to people on the world stage, that they would then use that time to talk to Nancy Reagan's astrologer. It was I gotta say, it's one of the most biased mainstream documentaries I've ever seen in my life. There's not a close second.
I've written 2 reviews of it, Joe. It is atrocious. It is worse than Triumph of the Will. It is, he completely glossed over the assassination attempt. It is really probably the worst documentary I've ever seen ever, and the worst documentary on Ronald Reagan. It's truly atrocious.
Okay.
Well, the fact that, again, all these years later, people can't get their arms around Reagan. There are a lot of things that he did that deserved criticism, a lot of things that he did that deserved praise. But it just reminds me, again, you can look at Perlman's book, who I thought wrote an extraordinary book on Goldwater and that revolution, wrote an extraordinary book on Nixonland, but then just like Edmund Morris, could not get to the essence of Ronald Reagan, and so wrote something that was just wildly off track.
Okay, up next, secrecy and spin, how Florida's governor misled the public on the COVID-19 pandemic. New reporting on what happened in Florida. Plus, an update on COVID relief talks from the newest member of the Democratic House leadership. And before we go to break, a big story in the music world to tell you about this morning. Universal Music Publishing Group has announced that it signed a landmark deal to purchase Bob Dylan's entire songwriting catalog. The deal includes classics.
Let me mention here for a second that with respect to Ronald Reagan and the other Republicans, they've used the Southern strategy, and that's a fact. And in fact, Ronald Reagan began his campaign for presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Look up that city, that history, what happened there. And that was a signal. And so, again, read Dog Whistle Politics, how coded racial appeal has reinvented racism, wrecked the middle class. There's one race, the human race. We're all human. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Everyone in America and everyone in the world.
Classics like Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are A-Changin', and Like a Rolling Stone, in what the New York Times says may be the biggest acquisition ever of music publishing rights of a single act. The price was not disclosed, but is estimated at more than $300 million. And speaking of playlists, make sure you get your Christmas playlist from Filter. The best of the old classics and some new ones as well. You might even hear a track or two from Joe's band, the Independent Council of Funk, that is exclusively on Filter. And speaking of chart toppers, our very own Steve Kornacki took his big board talents plus his signature khakis to NBC's Sunday Night Football last night. Take a look.